Hi everyone, welcome to Cinema Crave. Today, we're going back once again into the history of cinema. We're gonna take a look at a film whose visual effects never get old. No matter how much time passes, it still remains one of the best. Many movie lovers believe that the best film they have ever seen in their lives is Interstellar, directed by Christopher Nolan. We're gonna see where the idea for this film came from, how Nolan became the director, and how he once again used his own insane techniques to create stunning visuals without relying on special effects. It might be interesting for you to know that the idea for Interstellar was, one could say, born in the 1980s, when a young Kip Thorne, a physicist specializing in general relativity and a university professor, went on a date with Linda Obst, who was a film producer. The two of them went on that date but never fell in love. Instead, during their meeting, they got caught up in a conversation about how both of them were interested in making a film with completely scientific roots. During these talks, Kip Thorne managed to convince Linda that physics in reality is just as fascinating as it is portrayed in science fiction films. That romantic connection they had turned into a friendship that lasted for years, and the two made several science fiction films together, all of which had scientific foundations, for example, the film Contact. But in the year 2006, Linda came up with the main idea for the film. She had heard that it might be possible to travel through space using a wormhole. She went to Kip Thorne and said, "Look, I don't understand what all this means, but you come up with a movie idea based on wormholes and space travel." Kip Thorne insisted that whatever he wrote would be completely consistent with the science of physics. They both agreed, and the initial ideas for Interstellar were written. Linda, being a powerful producer, took the idea to Steven Spielberg. Now, why Spielberg? Because he was one of the best choices for directing a space movie. Besides, he was actually a friend of George Lucas. The two were working together at that time on the Indiana Jones films. Spielberg also had space-themed movies like E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind on his resume. On the other hand, Linda had heard that Spielberg himself was looking for such a project since he had founded DreamWorks and wanted to expand the company by making a massive space film. When they gave the idea to Spielberg, he fell in love with it. Interestingly, Kip Thorne talked with Spielberg for 14 consecutive hours about the main concept of the film. Spielberg was completely convinced that his next project would be Interstellar. But as I said, he was still working on Indiana Jones, so he hired a writer. And who was that writer? None other than Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother. Jonathan started working on the screenplay and spent 2 full years dedicating all his time to developing the story. But after those 2 years, around the year 2008, something unfortunate happened. Something that could have completely destroyed the entire project. As I mentioned before, at that time, Spielberg had founded the company DreamWorks a few years earlier along with his partners. Why did he start this company? To make it easier to produce his own films, meaning his company could finance and make his own movies. For example, Saving Private Ryan was produced by DreamWorks. But since this company was newly established, it didn't yet have the proper infrastructure for film distribution. So, they signed an exclusive deal with Paramount for Paramount to distribute their movies. Essentially, the newly founded DreamWorks went under the shadow of an entertainment giant, Paramount. After a few years, Paramount had gained so much control over DreamWorks that Spielberg grew tired of it. He said they were interfering in all his work. So, he decided to cut ties with Paramount and signed a new deal with Disney. That means in 2008, DreamWorks and Paramount split from each other. This was while the two studios had already been working together for 2 whole years on Interstellar. And the screenplay, which belonged jointly to both companies, it ended up just collecting dust. Why? Because of that exclusive contract. DreamWorks couldn't take the script and go make it with Disney. On the other hand, Paramount didn't have the right to produce the film either, because of the same agreement. So the project sat there untouched until the year 2012, meaning for 4 full years. During that time, Jonathan Nolan went on with his other work, but he always wished that this film, the one he had spent 2 years of his life on, would eventually be made. Jonathan Nolan once said something interesting. Every time he wrote a screenplay, he would test it with his own brother for jealousy. What does that mean? He would share the idea with his brother and carefully look into his eyes. If Christopher Nolan seemed jealous of the script, Jonathan knew he was on the right track. And he said Interstellar was one of those scripts that Christopher Nolan was truly jealous of. This is when Jonathan saw that his brother had released Batman: The Dark Knight Rises, and it had been very successful. Everyone was talking about it, and Jonathan was looking for a new project. On the other hand, Christopher Nolan had a lot of influence because he had made the Batman series and released Inception and The Prestige. So he went to his brother and said, "Come on, do something with this screenplay." Nolan then did something that all the media said only he could do. Instead of going to Paramount, he went to Warner Brothers, the company that had produced all his films up to that time, and sent that company to purchase the film rights for Interstellar from Paramount. Of course, it was not that simple. The situation was much more complicated than that. As I said, the rights to make Interstellar were divided between DreamWorks and Paramount, and neither could sell those rights separately to someone else. So Warner Brothers went to Paramount and transferred the rights to make a series of films to Paramount, and in return, Paramount transferred the rights to make another set of films to DreamWorks, so that DreamWorks would relinquish its rights to make Interstellar. After that, Paramount could give Warner the rights to make Interstellar, so Warner could share in the film's profits without spending any money. The collaboration between Warner Brothers and Paramount was unprecedented up to that time, and it was something Warner Brothers was willing to do only for Christopher Nolan. This way, finally, in the year 2013, that is, after 5 years of the project collecting dust and 7 years since the idea for the screenplay began, the project was transferred to Christopher Nolan. Here we move on to D, second act. When Christopher Nolan gathered his own team around him, he himself became responsible for the screenplay. He told his brother that as soon as he agreed to take on the film, he pulled the screenplay out from under Paramount's control. He would rewrite the entire screenplay from scratch. Jonathan Nolan agreed to change his screenplay. Then Christopher Nolan personally chose the actors. He took no auditions from most of them and called each actor to offer them the part. Kip Thorne was chosen as the scientific advisor, Linda became the primary producer, Hans Zimmer became responsible for the soundtrack, and Hoyt van Hoytema became the cinematographer, replacing Nolan's original cinematographer, the same cinematographer who had shot all of Nolan's films from Memento to The Dark Knight Rises, but had declined this film. The cinematography story is interesting. We will talk about it later. Nathan Crowley became the production designer. Before Interstellar, he had been nominated for Academy Awards for The Prestige and The Dark Knight. Paul Franklin became responsible for visual effects, the person who had designed the visual effects for Inception and who won an Academy Award in the year 2011. I'm listing these one by one to show what impact each of them had on the film. The team began their work and Christopher Nolan went straight to the screenplay, turning everything upside down. In Jonathan Nolan's original script, extraterrestrials were present. The character of Murph was a boy. China, side by side with the United States, was trying to solve the global problem. There were intelligent robots in the story that looked human and emotionally connected with the audience. In the end, Cooper would enter a gravitational machine built by the Chinese that allowed him to travel into the past through the power of gravity. But Nolan insisted that the story should move away from a sense of pure excitement and turn instead toward human emotion. For that reason, he began making major changes. The character of Murph became a girl precisely because at that time, Nolan himself had a daughter of the same age. If you watch the behind-the-scenes footage, you can see how Nolan interacts with his daughter. Interestingly, the story transforms into one about a father leaving home to work far away. Nolan himself was away from his own children for 4 months during production. It's also fascinating that when filming began, the movie was shot under a different name so that the media wouldn't discover what was happening. The fake title was Flora's Letter, Flora being the name of Christopher Nolan's own daughter. Nolan then made further changes to the screenplay. He completely redesigned the robots to be non-human in both appearance and emotion, making them look purely mechanical so that the audience would form no emotional bond with them. He entirely removed China and the extraterrestrials from the story. Instead, he added the character of Dr. Man, a human antagonist driven by his own survival instincts. In other words, Nolan rewrote everything to bring the story closer to human nature. Now, what's very interesting is that while Nolan was still writing the script and hadn't even completed the ending, he went to Hans Zimmer and asked him to compose the heart of the story through music. But since the screenplay wasn't finished yet, what could he possibly tell Zimmer? He handed him a letter written from a father to his son, expressing the longing and distance between them. At that time, Hans Zimmer also had a young son. Nolan told him, "First of all, know that our film is set in space. That's enough. Now, translate your own feelings as a father toward your son into music." Hans Zimmer spent just one night working on the piece, saying that the music needed two main qualities. First, it had to convey a sense of infinity, because the film was about space. And second, it had to evoke a spiritual, almost mystical feeling, because the story was about a father's love for his child. Therefore, he decided the music should be played on a church organ. And here's the amazing part: the score wasn't recorded in a studio. Instead, they went to one of the most sacred places in London, the Temple Church, the burial site of the Knights Templar. Why there? Because the Knights Templar were known for uniting faith and reason, they were intelligent people whose actions were guided by their beliefs, exactly like the balance between science and love that Interstellar sought to portray. Hans Zimmer's music was performed on the church's massive historical organ, which had more than 5,000 pipes. What's fascinating is that the sound engineers recorded the echoes, the sound waves reflecting off the church's ancient walls, columns, and tombstones to create a feeling of infinity. When this music was finally played, Nolan said, "Now I've found the heart of my story." He also mentioned something remarkable. While I was writing the screenplay, I constantly listened to that music, and I built the film's ending based on the ideas that came to my mind while hearing it. Christopher Nolan showed the same kind of thoughtful, emotional approach when choosing his actors. For example, he didn't just pick Matthew McConaughey casually. He asked for a meeting so they could sit and talk. They ended up spending 3 full hours discussing fatherhood and the role of men in society, both as men and as fathers. After those 3 hours of conversation, Christopher Nolan told Matthew McConaughey, "I'll send you the screenplay." For the role of Murph, the only actor Nolan auditioned in person was Mackenzie Foy. He auditioned many young actresses, but here's the interesting part. During the audition, none of them were allowed to speak. They had to act out a part of the film with no dialogue, expressing all the emotion through their facial expressions alone. In the end, Mackenzie Foy was chosen to play Murph. She's now 24 years old and appeared in the recently released The Conjuring. Timothée Chalamet was also chosen by Christopher Nolan for the film. It became the most important role he played at that young age and served as a major stepping stone for his acting career. Timothée Chalamet later said something very interesting. "When the film was released and I went to see myself on the big screen, I couldn't hold back my tears, not because I was happy, but because they had cut out almost all of my scenes." In the final version, he appears for barely 2 minutes. Nolan also did something fascinating with Jessica Chastain. The young actress who played the teenage version of Murph never met the adult Murph, Jessica Chastain, during the 4 months of shooting. Nolan believed that children tend to imitate adults, and he didn't want that to influence the younger performance. Instead, they showed Jessica Chastain the audition videos of the young actress and told her, "You take inspiration from her, reflect her energy and behavior in your performance. This way, the emotional continuity of the character went from child to adult, not the other way around." Nolan also pulled off a clever trick with Matt Damon. He kept his involvement completely secret. Neither the journalists nor even the marketing team knew Matt Damon was in the movie. So when audiences saw him appear on screen, it was a shocking and memorable surprise. Before filming began, Nolan arranged something remarkable. All the actors participated in an online session with NASA astronauts, including Mike Finkey. They directly discussed the experience of living in space and the feeling of longing for family, a powerful emotional preparation for their roles. As we've said, Nolan's team was crucial. Every member had a major influence on the film's success. On the technical side, 3 people were especially important: the cinematographer, the production designer, and the visual effects supervisor. Nolan had declared, "I want my film once again to rely as little as possible on digital effects. I'm not going to shoot it against a green screen. I want everything to be practical, built in reality." He also wanted to film with IMAX cameras to achieve the highest image quality possible. But that created a huge challenge. Because IMAX cameras, which record on film stock, are extremely large, heavy, and noisy. Nolan said, "To convey the sense of tension inside the spacecraft, the camera needs to be handheld." When his longtime cinematographer heard that, he decided to step away from the project. He was planning to direct his own film anyway. So Nolan brought in a new cinematographer who made a brilliant move. Together, they designed an entirely new kind of IMAX camera, the first handheld IMAX camera in the history of cinema. Its size and weight were significantly reduced, coming down to between 40 and 45 kilograms. Luckily, Nolan's cinematographer was a strong man. He could rest the camera on his shoulder and shoot handheld scenes. They even used special harness techniques to distribute the camera's weight and reduce strain on the body during filming. But the camera wasn't the only thing Nolan worked on to give the film a natural feel. In production design, they did something truly fascinating. First, they designed 3 spaceships, a lander which was completely capable of landing and could be controlled from outside the ship. Christopher Nolan himself personally handled the controls, and a Ranger ship, which was 15 meters long and mounted on 6-axis gimbals so it could move and even tilt vertically. Then there was the Endurance, the main mother ship that made the interstellar journeys. They created it as a miniature model at 1/15th scale. This model had a diameter of about 6 meters, meaning that in the story, the actual spacecraft we saw on screen would have been nearly 100 meters wide, about the size of a football field made up of 12 different modules. Then they did something even more impressive. They built a portion of the Endurance at full scale on the ground. Not all 12 sections, just 4 of them, constructing a curved metal frame at the exact angle we see in the movie. They recreated 4 real, full-sized modules. Attention to detail was crucial. For example, they didn't design large windows for the ship because the pilot of the mothership doesn't need to look outside. Navigation happens through computers. So, to make it more realistic and to improve protection for the crew, if anything hit the ship, they avoided oversized windows. In real spacecraft, everything is designed with extreme efficiency. Every bit of space is used perfectly. Chairs fold up, beds slide into the walls, and they replicated all of these designs inside the Endurance. Every single item had its proper place. For instance, if in the film the meeting room was next to the cockpit, in the real set, it was built exactly that way. There were no cinematic tricks where rooms were filmed separately. The layout was real and consistent with what appears on screen. Their creativity didn't stop there. For the outer space views seen through the windows, both in the full-scale and miniature models, they didn't use green screens like in most Marvel movies. Instead, if you look carefully, you'll notice a large, wide backdrop resembling a movie theater screen. Using extremely powerful projectors, they cast real images of galaxies and stars onto these screens. This choice made a huge difference. First, the images looked completely natural. Especially when filmed from inside the spacecraft, the star fields outside appeared authentic. Second, the light reflections were real. It looked exactly as if starlight were shining on the actors' faces. Third, the actors' performances became much more genuine. They no longer had to imagine what was in front of them, pretending there was a galaxy beyond a green screen. For Nolan, the actors' emotional authenticity was everything. The ship was also designed so that when Matthew McConaughey, playing the pilot, moved the ship's control stick, his seat tilted with the same intensity, allowing him to act with the same delicate precision that a real pilot would use when maneuvering. Now imagine this. The actor has a fully realistic environment, the camera is handheld, the cinematographer's movements naturally record the vibrations of the ship, and all of that together makes every moment feel incredibly real. They did other clever things in the set design too. To depict zero gravity, believe it or not, parts of the spacecraft were built vertically, even though in the film, we think they're horizontal. The actors were suspended by cables moving up and down while the camera was positioned in such a way that when the footage was shown, it appeared as if they were moving forward and backward horizontally. This created completely natural looking zero gravity motion. In scenes where they couldn't shoot vertically, they used a powerful mechanical arm that gently held and moved the actors through the ship's interior. Acting in these sequences was so physically demanding that stunt doubles had to perform some of the shots, since the movements required both strength and endurance. For filming the spacecraft scenes, Christopher Nolan used the very same technique that Stanley Kubrick had pioneered in 2001, a space odyssey. Nolan has often said that A Space Odyssey was the first movie that truly blew his mind. He was only 7 or 8 years old when his father took him to see it, and he became completely captivated by the world Kubrick had created. From that moment on, he dreamed of one day making a space film himself. If you look closely, Interstellar includes several subtle tributes to Kubrick, for example. The fact that the wormhole is positioned near Saturn. That's a direct nod to 2001, A Space Odyssey, since Kubrick had originally planned to depict Saturn, but couldn't due to the technological limitations of the time. Kubrick used miniature models for A Space Odyssey and developed a remarkable filming technique. The models didn't move, the camera did. The camera was mounted on a precise motion control arm that moved smoothly, and that motion created the illusion that the ship itself was floating in zero gravity. This exact technique later became a standard in all Star Wars films. In Interstellar, every detail you see of the Endurance spacecraft, even the sequence where the ship explodes, was filmed using these physical models. The team meticulously painted and detailed them by hand. Then, for explosion scenes, they actually lit and filmed these miniature models, sometimes using a light source positioned to mimic the glow of a nearby star before literally blowing up the miniature to capture the effect for real. Another fascinating element of the production design was the robot's TARS and case. Nolan intentionally had them designed as rectangular blocks to make them look more like tools than humanoid machines. What might surprise you is that these robots weren't CGI, and they weren't actual mechanical robots either. They were puppets, operated live on set. Each had a dedicated puppeteer physically controlling it, with the robot's structure connected to the puppeteer's body so that every movement of the operator directly translated to the robot's motion. Designing these robots was extremely difficult. It took a long time because their unusual geometry made them hard to maneuver, and they weighed around 90 kilograms. The designers had to build multiple versions to find one that moved smoothly enough to use during shooting. The robot you see shifting between different configurations in the film wasn't actually the same one each time for different movement styles. They built separate models. For example, the version that moved quickly across the surface was a different unit entirely, one mounted on a vehicle base. Now, as we said earlier, every single member of Nolan's team played a vital role, and this brings us to the visual effects. You might think that since so much of Interstellar was done using practical effects, the visual effects department wasn't that important. But in fact, the movie won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects thanks to one of the most groundbreaking achievements in modern cinema: the creation of a scientifically accurate black hole. This was one of Nolan's most extraordinary contributions to film. Before Interstellar, no human had ever seen what a black hole truly looked like. By 2013, when the movie was being made, scientists had known for decades, theoretically, that black holes exist, especially at the centers of galaxies like our own Milky Way. As you get closer to the galactic center, the density of stars increases until the light becomes so intense that we can't see what lies at the core. Scientists had determined that there must be an object there, one with a gravitational pull so powerful that millions of stars, each several times more massive than our sun, orbit around it. And yet, despite that immense mass, this object was smaller than our solar system. That could only mean one thing: a black hole. But here was the challenge. No one had ever visualized one accurately. The computer graphics programs used in cinema at the time, even advanced 3D software like 3ds Max or Maya, weren't built to simulate how light behaves under extreme gravity. None of them included physics based on Einstein's theory of general relativity. That's where Nolan's team took the leap. He turned to the visual effects studio Double Negative, the same company that had worked on Inception, The Dark Knight, and Harry Potter. Together, they set out to do something no filmmaker or scientist had ever done before: to use real physics to see a black hole as it would appear in reality. The double negative team, in collaboration with theoretical physicist Kip Thorne, decided to build an entirely new software program from scratch, one that could calculate the paths of millions of light rays traveling through curved space-time. They named it DNGR, short for Double Negative Gravitational Renderer. To create this program, more than 40,000 lines of code were written. The team worked for 4 months straight just to make the computer understand how light behaves near a black hole, how it bends, how it reflects, and ultimately what kind of image would emerge from the darkness. But computing that image wasn't simple. Each individual frame took more than 100 hours to render, and Double Negative's massive render farm, made up of hundreds of high-performance servers, worked around the clock for 7 months to generate the final output. Throughout that entire process, Kip Thorne personally reviewed every single frame to ensure the data was scientifically accurate. So, when you look at the black hole in Interstellar, whether on a cinema screen or your monitor, you're actually seeing the result of 7 months of computational thinking distilled into visual form. The final simulation file contained over 800 terabytes of data. But beyond the sheer volume of data, what truly mattered was the discovery hidden within it. For the first time, scientists noticed that the glowing ring of light around a black hole known as the accretion disk was visible not only from the front, but also from the top and bottom. The immense gravity of the black hole bent light so dramatically that even the back of the disk appeared visible from our perspective. Kip Thorne later said, "We weren't just doing this for cinema, we made an actual scientific discovery." The data was so precise that it became the foundation for a peer-reviewed scientific paper published in the prestigious journal Classical and Quantum Gravity. That kind of crossover between filmmaking and astrophysics is extraordinarily rare. And then came the ultimate moment of astonishment in 2019 when the Event Horizon Telescope captured the first real image of a black hole at the center of the galaxy M87. The world was stunned, because that image looked strikingly similar to what Christopher Nolan and Kip Thorne had visualized 5 years earlier in Interstellar. As a result, Nolan's team and Kip Thorne succeeded in creating the most scientifically accurate black hole ever depicted in cinema, an image so realistic that even today, NASA and astrophysicists continue to use it as an educational model. After these pre-production stages, we enter the third act when Christopher Nolan finally began filming. The shoot lasted 4 months in total. Before cameras rolled, for about 6 weeks, Matthew McConaughey and the 2 child actors playing his kids moved to Canada near the farm where the house scenes would be filmed. They spent that time living, driving, and working together on the farm so that their chemistry, their sense of family warmth would feel completely natural on screen. Then Nolan did something even more extraordinary. A few months before filming, he ordered that a real cornfield be planted at the shooting location, a functioning farm with $100,000 worth of corn. The strange part? That area had never been used to grow corn. Agricultural experts said it was impossible because the soil wasn't suitable for it. But Nolan insisted, precisely because he wanted to show a world on the edge of collapse, crops growing in soil that wasn't meant for them, symbolizing a dying Earth. To make it work, he consulted Zack Snyder, who had done something similar. With Snyder's advice, the plan succeeded, the corn grew, and when filming was finished, they actually sold it for a profit. Nolan had another clever idea. Remember those documentary-style clips in the movie, showing old people talking about dust storms and how life used to be? Those weren't actors. They were real interviews taken from an actual documentary called The Dust Bowl, which featured survivors of the real 1930 dust storms. Nolan repurposed the footage to give Interstellar a layer of haunting authenticity. After wrapping the farm scenes, Nolan moved on to 2 other major sequences: the water planet with its towering waves, and the ice planet where Dr. Mann lives. Both were filmed in Iceland, chosen because of its proximity to glaciers and its naturally cold, otherworldly landscapes. The water planet scenes were shot in a real glacial lagoon, a popular tourist attraction. Interestingly, Nolan later returned to that exact same location to film Dunkirk, using the experience he had gained from Interstellar. To reach these remote areas, the crew needed to transport massive equipment like cranes used to move the spacecraft. They even built 15 kilometers of temporary road, part of which ran underwater, flattened so vehicles could cross safely. The lagoon's rocky, solid floor made it perfect for supporting the heavy machinery. The temperature there was brutal, below 0 degrees Celsius with freezing winds. The water was only about 2 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. The cast and crew had to wear special insulated suits to avoid hypothermia. During one of the first takes, Anne Hathaway's suit malfunctioned. Water leaked inside, soaking her completely. At first, she stayed quiet, not wanting to interrupt Nolan's work. But soon after, she began to show signs of hypothermia and almost had to be rushed to the hospital. In the same country, Iceland, they also filmed the ice planet scenes in an area that contains what is considered Europe's largest glacier. The landscape there looks very different from Earth, with unusual ice formations. Interestingly, the visual effects team had to reduce the size of some of these ice cliffs digitally because Kip Thorne explained that given the planet's stronger gravity, the ice formations should be shorter. They adjusted them to an appropriate Earth-like scale so the visuals would feel realistic. After completing those scenes, the crew returned to the United States to film the final sequence, the Tesseract scene. Remarkably, this scene was created using a combination of 3 techniques: a real set, projector lighting, and visual effects. Many of the shadows you see on screen were cast by projectors, while VFX was used to enhance the infinite, multi-dimensional feel of the environment. The most challenging part was designing the 4-dimensional space where time and space could be visualized simultaneously. During pre-production, months of brainstorming went into figuring out exactly how to bring this scene to life. Many of the books seen in the Tesseract were projected, and the actor was suspended on cables, with only the nearby elements being real sets. Everything else was enhanced with visual effects. Filming officially wrapped by the end of 2013, and the film was released in November 2014. Upon release, it set a Guinness World Record for being the longest film ever shot entirely with IMAX cameras, running 2 hours and 47 minutes. The movie grossed over $700 million at the box office, another record, and in 2015, it became one of the most illegally downloaded films of the year, estimated at 46 million times. At the Oscars that same year, it won Best Visual Effects. Beyond awards and box office success, the film sparked a renewed public interest in physics. Kip Thorne wrote a book titled The Science of Interstellar, which became one of the best-selling books of the year, explaining the complex physics concepts behind the movie. Kip Thorne's accomplishments continued beyond the film. In 2017, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics not for Interstellar, but for a separate scientific discovery related to gravitational waves. In 2019, as mentioned earlier, the Event Horizon Telescope captured the first real image of a black hole, bringing Interstellar back into public conversation. Finally, in 2024, to celebrate the film's 10th anniversary, Interstellar was re-released exclusively in IMAX theaters, earning another $14 million. And with that, the story of one of the most ambitious and challenging films in cinema history comes to a close. I hope you found it fascinating. Thank you for watching until the end. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. See you in the next video. Goodbye.